print disability, which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Corrine, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the July 23rd, 2026 issue of the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. As always, thank you for joining us today. The highlights under business and finance are: IBM warned investors that its full-year revenue growth will be lower than it had previously forecast 1 week after suffering its worst single-day stock loss when executives previewed disappointing results. Google parent Alphabet posted 24% revenue growth year over year for the second quarter, but concern over the company's heavy spending on AI infrastructure damped investors' enthusiasm. Major U.S. stock indexes fell, with the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ retreating 0.1% and 0.6% respectively, and the Dow shedding less than 0.1%. The UK's rate of inflation in June declined to its lowest level in more than a year after gasoline costs fell. The EU approved Paramount's $81 billion bid to buy Warner Brothers Discovery after the companies offered concessions related to film distribution in Europe. Airbus shares in Paris rose 7% after the group said it aimed to significantly boost its profitability in the coming years from sales of commercial and military aircraft. British digital bank Revolut undertook a secondary share sale, increasing its valuation to $115 billion from $75 billion late last year. OpenAI raised its projected spending on computing power to around $750 billion through 2030, up from an earlier projection of roughly $600 billion. AMD and Anthropic signed a deal for tens of billions of dollars worth of AI servers, supplying Anthropic with much needed computing power. Now for the key articles under the Worldwide section. The U.S. and Saudi Arabia reached a landmark agreement to provide the kingdom with a civil nuclear program and potentially open the door to uranium enrichment on its territory. The U.S. is surging forces, medics, and weaponry to the Middle East to give Trump more muscular military options as he considers expanding the conflict against Iran. A federal judge in New York scheduled the criminal trial of ousted Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife for June 2027. Landlords filed a lawsuit seeking to overturn the new rent freeze on New York City apartments, challenging Mayor Zoran Mandani's signature campaign issue. Mandani appointed former Federal Trade Commission Chair Lena Khan to lead New York City's Economic Development Corporation. Anthropic doubled its spending on the midterm elections to $40 million in the midst of a ferocious debate about how to regulate the transformative technology. French prosecutors were investigating the death of a French modeling scout with ties to Jeffrey Epstein after he was found dead at his home outside Paris. A Florida teen suing social media platforms over claims their design led to mental health issues dropped his lawsuit against Meta platforms ahead of a trial slated to begin next week. Died James Woolsey, 84, former CIA director. The headline, Soldiers Killed in the Mid-East Come Home. The picture shows soldiers carrying a casket from an airplane as dignitaries are saluting. And that caption reads, Tribute. President Trump and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth attended the transfer of the bodies of 4 soldiers killed in the Iran war in a ceremony at Dover, Delaware on Wednesday. They salute as the coffin of Private Isabella Gonzalez is brought off a plane. Surge of forces gives Trump options to escalate Iran war, by Shelby Holliday, Lara Sigelman, and Stephen Kalin. Influx of troops, medics, weaponry comes after deadly strikes by Tehran. Washington. The U.S. is surging forces, medics, and weaponry to the Middle East to give President Trump more muscular military options as he considers expanding the conflict against Iran, according to people familiar with the matter. In the past week, special operation forces have deployed to the region from their U.S. bases, according to flight tracking data and U.S. officials. Squadrons of jet fighters have been staged across the Middle East, and bomber aircraft at bases in the U.S. and U.K. are on high alert to ramp up operations, according to one of the officials. Additionally, more than 150 medics have arrived at the Lungstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany in recent days, another official said. The hospital is the primary location for treating troops injured in combat in the Middle East. The preparations are the latest indication that Trump is considering escalating the conflict after 3 U.S. soldiers were killed in an Iranian attack in Jordan in recent days. A 4th service member was killed in Iraq during a controlled detonation of an Iranian drone. Retired General Joseph Votel, the former commander of U.S. Central Command and U.S. Special Operations Command, said the surge itself doesn't necessarily mean major military operations are inevitable. The big idea here is to give the President and the Secretary of Defense the most flexibility, the force, the most options to present to them, Votel said. A spokesman for the Pentagon referred questions about troop movements to the U.S. Central Command, which declined to discuss details, citing operational security. In a statement, the White House said Trump always has all options at his disposal. The troop surge could also be designed to give Trump more capacity to target Yemen's Houthi militants, who threatened this week to impose a naval blockade on Saudi Arabia. On Wednesday, a tanker sailing through the Red Sea off Saudi Arabia was struck by an unknown projectile, sparking a fire, according to the UK Maritime Trade Operations. The Houthis' military spokesman said the group had targeted 2 Saudi oil tankers with ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones. Concerns have risen in Washington about the U.S.'s endgame and the mounting cost of the war, which has reached more than $37 billion, according to congressional testimony this week by Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. Returning to all-out war also risks further draining U.S. munitions and exacerbating disruptions to global oil supplies as Iran continues to attack commercial ships transiting the Strait of Hormuz. On Wednesday, the Republican-controlled House voted 216 to 214 to pass a $95 billion budget framework that includes an extra $73 billion in defense and intelligence funding, a first step in approving money sought by the White House. Some Republicans have aired concerns that voting for additional funds would be interpreted as approval from Congress for the war itself. I want to pay the troops. I do not want to support the war, said Representative Brian Fitzpatrick, Republican from Pennsylvania, who voted for the measure. The House also approved 216 to 212, its version of the National Defense Authorization Act policy bill, with little support from Democrats who say Trump has illegally bypassed Congress in waging the war. Trump and Hegseth have defended the war, now in its 5th month, as necessary to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. Trump on Wednesday threatened to bomb a bridge or power plant each time Tehran attacks a vessel traveling through the strategic waterway. U.S. Central Command said later it launched a 12th consecutive day of strikes against Iran. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said in a social media post that any aggression against Iran, including our infrastructure, will compel a powerful and decisive response. Saudi's U.S. set landmark nuclear accord. Deal gives kingdom a civilian program. American firms' big role in development. By Michael R. Gordon and Stephen Kalin. The U.S. and Saudi Arabia have reached a landmark agreement to provide the kingdom with a civilian nuclear program and potentially open the door to uranium enrichment on its territory, the Trump administration said on Wednesday. The 30-year, multi-billion-dollar deal gives U.S. companies a central role in developing Saudi Arabia's nuclear infrastructure while shutting out foreign competitors. A key provision of the new accord would have U.S. companies build a uranium enrichment facility in Saudi Arabia if a joint U.S.-Saudi study determines such a step would be warranted. That stipulation would give the U.S. influence over the Saudi nuclear program, and Trump administration officials argue a way to prevent it from being misused for military purposes. The deal is expected to be submitted to Congress for review in the coming days. It is already proving controversial among many lawmakers who oppose the spread of nuclear technology in the volatile Middle East, but will be difficult to block. Doing so would require a joint resolution and a two-thirds majority vote, if needed, to override a potential presidential veto. Trump last week formally approved the deal, which includes an agreement on nuclear cooperation and a bilateral safeguards document. They were signed Wednesday by Energy Secretary Chris Wright, who discussed the deal during his first overseas trip to the region in April 2025 with his Saudi counterpart, Prince Abdulaziz bin Salman, who will also sign the deal. The agreement could help revitalize the U.S. nuclear industry, strengthen U.S.-Saudi ties, and deny Russia and China a strategically important role in the Saudi nuclear program, said Robert Einhorn, a former longtime senior State Department official who advised both Republican and Democratic administrations on non-proliferation issues. But unless it contains adequate constraints, including on enrichment, it could increase nuclear proliferation risks in the Middle East and beyond, Einhorn said. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. IBM cuts outlook after grim warning by Anissa Gardaisi. Much of IBM's revenue is tied to its data center business, where the company sells servers known as mainframes to enterprise customers such as financial services firms and retailers. IBM warned investors on Wednesday that its full-year revenue growth will be lower than it had previously forecast, 1 week after suffering its worst single-day stock loss in history when executives previewed disappointing results. International Business Machines posted its second quarter earnings Wednesday, confirming the results that it previewed last week in a rare move that erased about $67 billion in stock market value. Big Blue's infrastructure revenue of $3.8 billion was down 7% from a year earlier. That unit was pulled down by lower than expected sales of data center mainframes, which fell 42%. IBM now expects full-year revenue growth to be in a range between 4% and 5%. Earlier this year, the company projected full-year growth of more than 5%. More than 1,000 Americans racked up IRAs worth at least $25 million by Ann Tergeson and Theo Francis. The average American family has about $268,300 in individual retirement accounts. Gregory Bazukis holds at least $68 million and possibly a whole lot more. Bazuki, 61 years old, is one of hundreds of people who bought stakes in promising startups when the shares were worth peanuts, stashing them in retirement accounts and watching their values balloon to 8 figures or more. What they are getting essentially is the mother of all tax breaks. IRAs and workplace retirement accounts were created to help working Americans save for old age by providing tax incentives for doing so. The accounts have been supercharged by startup founders, hedge fund managers, and Silicon Valley insiders who have access to investment opportunities unavailable to most Americans. Those entrepreneurs and their financial backers are increasingly using that strategy to pile up giant retirement account balances, all subsidized by U.S. taxpayers. The Wall Street Journal determined by analyzing regulatory filings, government data, and other documents. The number of people with giant retirement accounts has soared in recent years, aided by booms in both stock prices and startup formation. Senator Ron Wyden, an Oregon Democrat, and Representative Richard Neal, a Massachusetts Democrat, introduced a bill this week that would require annual withdrawals from accounts over $10 million for individuals of any age. The legislation stemmed in part from long-running concerns that some investors might circumvent annual contribution limits on retirement accounts by undervaluing shares in companies that aren't public, thus substantially increasing their tax benefits, the Government Accountability Office wrote in 2014. This is an egregious loophole we've got to close, Wyden said. Bazuki is the brother of the founder and CEO of online gaming company Roblox and is himself a longtime board member at that company. Others with huge retirement account balances also are insiders at some of the most successful startups of recent decades. By purchasing early at low prices, they could amass big stakes inside their retirement accounts while remaining within annual contribution limits intended to keep tax subsidies modest. Those are currently $7,500 for IRAs and $24,500 for 401ks, with people 50 and older allowed to contribute more. Japan's prima ballerina remains on point at 77, by Jason Douglas and Yunko Fukutomi. Tokyo. Yoko Marashita was 3 years old when she first put on a pair of ballet shoes. 75 years later, she's still on point. Morishita, who will turn 78 in December, is the prima ballerina in Japan's storied Matsuyama Ballet Company. One of Japan's most celebrated dancers, she performed with Rudolf Nureyev 200 times and toured with Margot Fonteyn. Today she is the world's oldest ballerina, still taking on demanding lead roles. Fans lose themselves literally at this rapper's concert. Pitbull devotees flock to shows in bald caps. It's fun until they lose track of their friends. By Julia Munslow. As a crowd of mostly women danced the night away at Pitbull's recent concert in London, barely a hair was out of place. That's because fans of the man born Armando Christian Perez have an unofficial dress code at his shows that emulates the rapper's signature look. Aviator sunglasses, a black tie, and a white shirt, topped off with a bald cap. It's embarrassing if you don't come with one, Christy Downs, 35, said as several other pit bull lookalikes strode through Hyde Park on the way to the show. But as Downs and other members of the Bald Cap Brigade often learn, loyalty can come at a price. You start walking off with the wrong pit bull, said Downs. I'm walking and I'm like, oh, I'm with Denise. No, I'm not. I'm with Dave. I don't know Dave. Factor in the patchy phone service, and getting lost is almost inevitable. Leaving the front page, USMCA discussions could roll into 2027 by Gavin Bade. The negotiation of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement could stretch into 2027, the U.S. trade chief told senators Wednesday, though the Trump administration hopes for some partial agreements with Canada and Mexico by the end of this year. The U.S. wants to have separate interim agreements with Mexico and Canada ready for President Trump to review by the end of this year, U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer told the Senate Finance Committee. But talks on other issues, like how much American content must be in automobiles and other products, could take more time. New York City landlords sue over rent freeze. Mayor's housing plan faces first legal test as plaintiffs decry review board process. By James Finelli and Rebecca Picciotto. A group of landlords filed a lawsuit on Wednesday seeking to overturn the new rent freeze on New York City apartments, the real estate industry's first legal challenge to Mayor Zohran Mamdani's signature campaign issue. The lawsuit accused the New York City Rent Guidelines Board of going through a sham process before voting 7-1 in June for 0 rent increases on 1- and 2-year leases. The board is supposed to act independently, but the lawsuit claims that Mamdani influenced the outcome. The plaintiffs say they are the first to challenge the legal basis for the freeze. The suit, filed in a New York State court, was brought by 5 small landlords who own rent-subsidized apartments in the city. A spokesman for the mayor said the Rent Guidelines Board is an independent body. We are confident that the board evaluated all of the relevant data and considered the factors facing both tenants and landlords across New York City, the spokesperson said. The Rent Guidelines Board declined to comment. The suit signals discontent in the real estate industry over Mamdani's policies aimed at making housing more affordable as rents have surged to records. The rent freeze applies to roughly 1 million rent-regulated apartments on leases that begin on or after October 1st. Mamdani last week also issued a 23-point plan to address a variety of other renter complaints, including strengthening the city's ability to take legal action against negligent landlords with numerous safety violations. Real estate Group said the plan unfairly demonizes their industry. The Democratic Socialist mayor stacked the board with loyalists who manipulated data on landlord expenses and income to reach their conclusions, the lawsuit says. Other former mayors, such as Eric Adams, also appointed a majority of the board's members, but the suit says Mamdani had City Hall representatives give board members a special briefing on the true cost of living in New York City, leaving no doubt what the mayor expected of his hand-picked board supermajority. The board is required by law to review the economic conditions of the residential real estate industry before taking a vote. The plaintiffs accuse the board members of instead cherry-picking data to understate operating cost and overstate the financial performance of landlords. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. From the editorial page, Operation GOP Military Rescue. Reconciliation 3.0 is the best chance Republicans have to shore up defense. Congress is living down to its approval rating and preparing for an August vacation, and soon the election will absorb all the oxygen in Washington. The best use of the twilight is a real push to shore up America's military and expand its defenses, which would also give Republicans an accomplishment to tout on the trail. The House voted late Wednesday afternoon to unlock the reconciliation process that lets the GOP pass its priorities through the Senate with 51 votes. The House's $95 billion outline would allow about $60 billion for the Pentagon, which for months has been running a war in the Middle East and needs a cash infusion for ship maintenance, gas, and combat pay. I understand and am told that some military services face near-term solvency challenges. Senator Susan Collins of Maine said in a committee hearing about the administration's Iran war requests this week. Near-term solvency challenges isn't a phrase you want to hear from your bank or your military. In a saner Washington, a bill to keep America's military in fuel during combat would pass with unanimous consent. But Democrats are willing to cut off the troops, even as U.S. forces strike Iran almost nightly. The clerics in Iran understand that U.S. congressional dysfunction is one of their wartime assets. Democratic appropriator Patty Murray thundered that the U.S. is considerably less safe after President Trump's war because our stockpiles have been depleted and it will take years of production to fully replenish them, no matter how much money is thrown at the problem. But she opposes funding for the express purpose of buying and producing more missiles. Democratic obstruction is a disgrace, but it isn't an excuse for Republicans or Mr. Trump, who ran on a stronger national defense and a willingness to use it. The president proposed a $1.5 trillion defense budget for next year, which is the right level of effort for deterring two nuclear powers in China and Russia. But the administration is relying on a reconciliation bill to pass $350 billion of that total. That proposal is separate from the Iran request because it aims to prevent a future and far more catastrophic war with an adversary like China. The U.S. military needs more weapons and a richer mix of firepower. See the bargain brand Patriot Interceptor rolled out this week by Lockheed Martin. The U.S. is on the edge of breakthroughs in defense technology, but the government has to buy the products so investors take the risk. A missing ingredient is sustained funding from Congress, which brings us back to the House. GOP leaders seem to think $95 billion is all that its narrow majority can bear in a reconciliation bill, and the conference's fiscal hawks want compensation cuts. But if the GOP can't muster the votes for more health care reform or pro-growth tax policy, the least it can do is prepare the U.S. for advances in drone warfare and artificial intelligence risks. They won't get this chance again if Democrats take Congress, as they probably will. The better approach is to combine as much as politically possible of the president's proposed $350 billion in the Iran money into one GOP reconciliation bill. That is an accomplishment that would be worth the inevitable tough amendment votes that Democrats will put up in the Senate during the process. I truly believe Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Dan Kane told Congress Tuesday that we're at one of those moments in history where we have a choice to make, just given what I see in the next couple ridge lines. The U.S. military is America's greatest insurance policy, he said. And as difficult as it is to pay for insurance before we need it, the U.S. must have insurance before the storm comes. If there's a better use of GOP's waning majority than buttressing American defenses, we haven't heard it. Saudi nuclear enrichment is a mistake. Trump made the hard decision to fight in Iran, but flunks the easier one. Why does Saudi Arabia need to enrich uranium on its home soil? The answer isn't complicated. It doesn't, unless it would like to establish the rudiments of a nuclear weapons program as a contingency. The more difficult question to answer is why the Trump administration is going along with it. The Trump administration said Wednesday it signed a civilian nuclear agreement with the Saudis, winning new contracts for U.S. firms at the price of nuclear non-proliferation safeguards. The deal will now be submitted to Congress, and it will be difficult to find the 2/3 majority needed to override a presidential veto. Congress should still scrutinize the details. The deal breaks from the gold standard of non-proliferation, which would prohibit domestic uranium enrichment and plutonium reprocessing. Instead, it establishes a 2-year study by the U.S. and Saudi Arabia into the value and commercial viability of Saudi enrichment, after which a decision will be made. What's to study? Everyone knows it isn't cheaper to begin enriching over there. But commissioning a study is a Washington dodge, and Congress will want to know whether the administration is stringing it along with a formality. The stakes are high. The risk of nuclear weapons catastrophe increases each time nuclear enrichment spreads. That's why the bipartisan U.S. consensus has been to stop the spread of the most dangerous processes and capabilities to enemies and allies. The next best way to prevent nuclear proliferation is with inspections and monitoring, but the Trump deal weakens those too. The tried and true method is the International Atomic Energy Agency's additional protocol. The United Arab Emirates signed up for it, along with the gold standard of no domestic enrichment, as a condition of its 2009 nuclear deal negotiated largely with George W. Bush. But now the Saudis have been allowed to reject the additional protocol and receive U.S. support all the same. The Trump administration says it has devised a bilateral safeguards agreement of its own, but we doubt the Saudis rejected the standard protocol in favor of even stricter inspections. They are bound to be weaker, establishing the precedent that each U.S. ally can push for its own preferential monitoring. Expect Turkey and Egypt to come calling, and we know how this president loathes to say no to Turkey's Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And why would the UAE, which has been a far better ally to the U.S. than Saudi Arabia during the war with Iran, now be content to follow the rules alone? It will be far more difficult to prevent nuclear enrichment capability from spreading across the volatile region. This deal's origins are in the Biden administration, which held out nuclear cooperation as a reward if the Saudis were to join the Abraham Accords. Riyadh has resisted pressure to do so, but its reward now arrives from the Trump administration anyway. One has to hope the Saudis have offered something more. The U.S. needs Arab allies, and it has much to offer oil-rich Saudi Arabia as it diversifies its economy. But the Saudis don't need a path to a nuclear bomb to match Iran. Mr. Trump and the U.S. military have been making sure of that. Why undermine that success now? You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. From the opinion pages, will Democrats disavow the DSA platform? It promises to build a new society from the ground up. France tried that in 1792. By Karl Rove. It's a seductive tale. Nasty villains with evil plans to make us miserable. But they can be beaten. When they are, life will be fuller and more rewarding with peace and harmony forever. All you have to do is elect us. That's no second-rate movie script. It's the platform of the Democratic Socialist of America, DSA. Workers deserve more. Once a fringe group, the DSA has become a rising faction within the Democratic Party. The DSA platform calls food, education, energy, medicine, and transportation common goods and utilities to be run by government through public ownership of the largest corporations and essential industries. The government takeover of the economy would bring about the end of capitalism. That's paradise. No more worrying about cost. No more dreading going back to work as we labor for our common good instead of private profit. What the platform omits is that when government is in charge of food, education, energy, medicine, and transportation. You'll have to take what the government gives at the price it sets and relinquish the ability to make core decisions about your daily life. Today, if you don't like a job, grocery store, restaurant, doctor, hospital, car, or airline, you can pick another. Because free markets empower you as a consumer, you have technology, services, and goods that in the past would have been available only to the very wealthy, if at all. If the DSA has its way, those free market blessings will evaporate. It promises new publicly owned social housing. In practice, it would look something like the giant blocks of Soviet-era apartments in Moscow. When government is the landlord, you live where you're assigned. You may not like where that is. The DSA platform is also economically impossible to achieve. It calls for a 32-hour work week with full pay and benefits. For businesses to keep operating at current levels, they'd have to hire 20% more people. How many businesses have the cash to spare? For that matter, where will they find 20% more workers? The DSA makes expensive promises that would bankrupt the country. Universal health care at no cost to individuals is one of the many free things government will dispense. Also on the list, all medical education and training, paid family leave, education from pre-K to college, reparations, and a green future with massive investment in sustainable, publicly owned energy. The group would also cancel all student debt, adding nearly $1.9 trillion to the national debt. Workers deserve more is chock full of fantastical promises. Speaking of bills, you don't really have them anymore. How would that work? You have no debt, and you don't pay a mortgage or have a landlord. It's reminiscent of Steve Martin's bit, "You can be a millionaire and never pay taxes." How? First, get $1 million. The DSA would also demilitarize police departments and redirect funding as steps toward fully abolishing the police and prison system. Borders would be completely open. Every migrant would be eligible for citizenship and could vote before naturalizing. DSA would defund the Department of War. Yes, it uses Donald Trump's designation for the Pentagon and closes overseas military bases. The DSA would end all military and economic aid to Israel and possibly end Israel. Palestinians would have the right to self-determination in a free Palestine with Jerusalem as its capital. When the billionaire class loses power, the DSA imagines the world will become peaceful. Those bosses deliberately brought about wars in Beirut, Gaza, and Tehran. The platform doesn't mention terrorist regimes or anti-American dictators. You'll search in vain to read who slaughtered 1,100 people in Israel on October 7, 2023, or who invaded Ukraine on February 24, 2022. The Constitution is also on the chopping block. Building a New Society from the Ground Up, France 1792, and Russia 1917, anyone? Entails making the District of Columbia a state expanding the size of the House, and instituting ranked choice voting. Also abolishing the Senate and the Electoral College, though the latter wouldn't give way to the popular vote. Instead, the platform calls to replace the President and Supreme Court with an executive and judiciary chosen by and subordinate to Congress. The DSA platform is a huge gift for Republicans if they focus on its substance. For Democrats, it's a real threat, but also an opportunity. Wise Democrats will define themselves by what they're against. Not only Mr. Trump, but also the hardcore socialists in their midst. Democrats need to find the courage to say that the DSA is a wrecking ball that threatens to destroy both the party and America. Letters to the editor. The GOP's reconciliation gets the job done. As a Republican member of the House Budget Committee, I have a different perspective than your editorial, the GOP's Budget Reconciliation Bust, July 17th. The reality is that we currently face practical, immediate funding needs that require a practical, immediate response. President Trump's decision to launch Operation Epic Fury, destroying Iran's offensive capabilities and ensuring it can never develop a nuclear weapon, was bold, historic, and I think correct. But on a practical level, it is also a decision that requires a significant expenditure of resources from our military stockpiles and from the Defense Department's budget. This reconciliation effort fills that hole in our budget, allowing our armed forces to continue operating at the highest level and deter our adversaries in the Middle East and around the globe. While this specific legislation may not be as broad and far-reaching as last year's One Big Beautiful Bill, it is no less critical for our national security, election integrity, and for the well-being of the American people. Many of the concerns your editorial raises seem to be born of the belief that Republicans are certain to lose power in November, so it's worth cramming in whatever the GOP can to this last legislative hurrah. I disagree. Legislation by panic is no way to govern. Republicans should operate with seriousness and a steady hand to address the hole in our defense budget and to ensure the safety and security of our people. Since the 2024 elections, Republicans have made sweeping reforms to lower taxes for seniors and working families, crack down on wasteful spending, cut the bloated federal bureaucracy, end the wasteful flow of our tax dollars to U.S. aid boondoggles, and revitalize the flailing Biden-era economy. These efforts stand in stark contrast to the Biden administration's mismanagement, and I trust that Americans understand the difference well. The reforms necessary to fix our health care system, address the national debt, and effectively deter our adversaries on the world stage will never be achieved by a single Hail Mary piece of legislation. It will require years of steady and effective governance. That is what Republicans are committed to providing, and this budget reconciliation effort is an important piece of that plan. We must never let the needs of our service members go unanswered. From Representative Addison McDowell, Republican from North Carolina. Another letter, the topic, the real threat to democracy, voter apathy. Regarding Senator Lisa Murkowski's op-ed, Why I'm Voting Against the Save America Act, July 18th, I am a GOP precinct chairman here in Harris County, Texas, and the main purpose of my role is to encourage the voters in my precinct to take the time to cast their ballots, albeit as a partisan. But the job is equally difficult for both parties. All of President Trump's voter fraud claims and all of progressives' foolishness about how we are seeing an existential threat to democracy pale in comparison to what I see. Voter apathy and accompanying low turnout is the number one threat to our representative republic. Our system only functions if citizens vote for who we wish to represent us and hold those representing us accountable for defending our constitutional rights. Perhaps the government should fine every voter $250 for each election in which he doesn't participate. It'd make clear the cost of voter apathy. I would bet requiring ID would then be more acceptable to prove you did your civic duty. From Chris Dimes, Katy, Texas. Same topic. If the Save America Act's primary requirements, providing photo ID and proof of citizenship, are considered too onerous to enact, preventing illegal voting will remain elusive. Maybe Congress should flip their approach, enforce strict consequences after a violation occurs. A swift, mandatory 3-year jail sentence for anyone casting an illegal vote could serve as an effective deterrent and an alternative to the Save America Act. From Gregory Marshall, Marietta, Georgia. New topic, easier to dance on a grave than argue a point. Regarding Louise Perry's op-ed, How Did We Come to Bash the Dead? Miss Perry frames the issue as a general societal decline, but all of her examples, with the exception of Donald Trump, come from the left. Leftists seem often to believe their cause is so just that they can simply ignore accepted norms. This is true on issues ranging from the Senate filibuster and the number of Supreme Court justices all the way to the celebration of violence, as with the killings of Charlie Kirk, United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson, or Ann Widdecombe. From Steve Schwartz, Los Angeles. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the July 23rd issue of the Wall Street Journal. We read from the Wall Street Journal every Monday through Thursday at 11 p.m. Your reader has been Corrine. Thank you for listening, and enjoy the weekend.